Welcome to Peter and Phil's Courageous Conversations, a podcast addressing race relations and social issues in hopes that you'll be inspired to do the same. Now, let's begin our conversation with your hosts, Dr. Peter Weinstein and Dr. Philip Nelson.
Good day, Dr. Nelson. Always a pleasure to see you. This could be a very long conversation, could be very short, depending upon what you want to talk about today. But the news has been hot and heavy, hasn't it?
Yeah, I almost called you.
What were you going to call me? Let's thank our listeners for joining us today, and also thank Nationwide for their support in our endeavors to have these courageous conversations. And now, where do you want to dive in?
I'm gonna let you do the diving. I'll just tread water.
When we first started these conversations, I commented that it felt like we were going backwards.
Yes.
And with the recent decisions, it kind of validates and codifies that we are, at least our government in some cases, is trying to go backwards by undoing things that were in place for generation. Whether we're talking about affirmative action, whether we're talking about the decision regarding cost of education, or whether we're talking about the decision regarding LGBTQ, I feel like in many ways we're undoing a lot of progress that we had made.
Yeah. Let me start by saying the road to progress has circles in
it. Speed bumps?
No, not just speed bumps. They're actually, you know how Great Britain has a lot of circles.
The roundabouts.
The roundabouts. And there are certain cities in the US that use roundabouts.
Yeah.
And if you're not used to it, when you get into one, sometimes you don't know how to get off.
Yep.
Societal progress sometimes have roundabouts.
I guess we got off at the wrong exit.
And I'm not sure that they're not useful.
Okay.
I think sometimes we take exits thinking that they're going in the right direction, but they may cause as much harm as we've been trying to address. I need to be clear here. The day that SCOTUS decision on affirmative action came out was a bad day for me. I seriously thought about calling you to talk about it off the record. I can tell you that this will not be our last discussion on any of the issues, because I haven't read the decisions and I intend to read the decisions. But if there's one place where there ought to be a courageous conversation, it should be at the level of the Supreme Court. And if there's one place where we should accept reasoned approaches, it should be at the Supreme Court level. And as disappointed as I am in the most recent decisions, I am forcing myself to give the decisions themselves a reasoned chance. So I think the Supreme Court decision on affirmative action came out on Wednesday. I canceled everything. I was so devastated by the decision. I'm sorry, not by the decision, but by some of the reports of the reasoning behind the decision. I'm actually somewhat hardened by the decision, and I'll tell you why. I think that we have been distracted by formulas in our attempt to try to redress the wrongs of the past. And we've been distracted by formulas because it was easier to get something done that way than to address reality. And though that may have been the best solution at the time, our failure was we let it rest there. And in doing so, we created harm to others. And so the decision itself doesn't bother me. The lack of recognition of reality does.
I think we've lost touch with reality, and it just That I think is what I mean. And one of the other decisions that I'm just going to sidebar for just a second, was the Mississippi voting decision, where they didn't take on the case that disenfranchised Black voters.
That came out yesterday?
No, they just declined to take up the challenge to the statute that bars individuals convicted of certain felonies from voting. So this came out, within the last 24 hours, Friday. So yes.
I'm not prepared to talk about that.
But I'm just specifically in Mississippi, and in light of everything you and I have talked about over the last 3 years and the challenges that your dad had voting, it's worth at some point addressing that. But
yes, it is. It is. And so, yes, this goes back to my roundabout theory again.
Yeah.
This proves the nonsense that we are a post-racial society. That once Barack Obama was elected, it proves that that race is no longer matters. When race, as mythical as it is to me, is still the basis for many of our policies. We have not gotten rid of redlining. We have not gotten rid of voter restrictions. We have not practiced one man, one vote ever. And many of us see the glass as half full. Well, actually, everybody sees the glass as half full, no matter which side you're on. It's as if I have the right to vote, there's this mentality that my right to vote takes your right away or affects your right to vote. When in reality, those who had the vote and controlled the results are just trying to raise the goalpost so that they can unduly influence the results. Some of us think about a true democracy and the ability to participate in a true democracy. Others of us are only concerned with outcomes.
Well, I took you away from the discussion on affirmative action because I forgot to bring this up as well. And this was the one that, just based upon all of our conversations on top of affirmative action, just got my attention. And this concept of roundabouts and everything else still doesn't make it any easier to be in the roundabout and get cut off by somebody because they want to get there faster, or they're not paying attention, or whatever the case may be. Because it's just, as Sharon and I were just talking, and she said, what's become of us? Where are we headed? What does this all mean? And how can the Supreme Court bring these decisions down? I said, it's become political. I mean, that's really what has happened, in my opinion, is that the Supreme Court has become so politicized, sorry about the redundancy, that the logic is gone. The concepts are gone. I don't get it. I don't understand it. And I'm sure that's what you wanted to talk about on Wednesday when you almost picked up the phone and gave me a call.
Yes, well, Wednesday I was in despair.
Yeah.
Because of the questions that Sharon was raising. I mean, clearly it's easy to sit there and say, what is this world coming to? But we've had these conversations before. Where, this world has not changed. It's about who happens to be in office at and who gets to express their opinion, who gets to be in the majority, if you will.
Yeah.
As I said, I downloaded opinions of the affirmative action case yesterday, but I haven't read it. I want to make sure that I am as objectively centered as I can be as I begin to read it. I have heard snippets. I have heard analysis of the snippets of them. And it's my sense that the Asian students that took the Harvard case to court proved the discrimination of Asians in Harvard's attempt to address diversity. My despair is rooted in the fact that many choose to use that as saying that there's a two-pronged message here that I refute. One is, because of their ill-fated attempts, African Americans that were accepted into Harvard didn't deserve to be. And white Americans that didn't get into Harvard were wrongfully denied. And I don't believe that this decision proves either of those cases. For me, I noticed in California now, there's a push toward community-based schooling. And it sounds so holistic. It sounds so appropriate.
Air quotes, right?
Yes. And I actually support it. I think in another conversation, I was once irate at Representative Green from Georgia, who berated and demeaned an educator for being the architect of closing the schools down during COVID. Now, I'm not sure I know just what the answer should have been, but I do know when there's a public health threat, you can't afford to take half measures. And instead of blaming the teachers and the administrators of education, I don't understand why parents don't share in that blame for the apparent outcomes of lower test grades and lower performance standards that we now see and attribute to the COVID isolation. I don't understand how we can look at one aspect, test scores, and decide that we would rather there was some ultra state plan to hurt our children. I don't understand how we can focus on this and put blame on an industry when the alternative was to put our children at greater risk. I don't understand how we can't look at our children and recognize they're still here. That what we're arguing for is the possibility of losing our children or losing more of our children than we lost. I don't understand how we can rewrite even recent history and forget the fear we had as a public about a virus we knew nothing about.
We as, and I don't want to, maybe I shouldn't generalize, but we always seem to look to find somebody else to blame. We globally, in many cases, refuse to accept accountability, and we would rather defer it to others. And so I really do think that when it comes to school, parents almost use school as I get my kids out of the house, keep them there, keep them in after day school. I don't want them home. Oh, you mean I got to help them with their homework? And if they don't turn out okay. So I do think not just school, but in every case, from a speeding ticket on down, everybody wants to blame somebody else. And we need to start to toughen up and start to be responsible for the actions and have a voice and not just continue to sit back and look to blame others. And so, in politics, you vote with you change with your vote. And so, and I think I've heard this from you, if we're really wanting to make a difference in the global scheme of things, we got to go to the ballot and we've got to make the changes that will affect the changes that we'd like to see.
Again, I put that on the table because to me, it's all interrelated. Democracy is a political engine, but it is not a cultural, it is not the end all of cultural change. You can't legislate hearts. That is a totally different arena in order to affect change. And even if you change your heart, you must then change your practices. And it is not all based on law and legal protections and legal redress. And that is our disappointment. To ignore reality when you're making law just leads to bad laws. And my concern about our children's intellectual growth and the results of COVID, et cetera, seems to be focused on who's at fault, rather than how are we going to address this. And that is the same approach I'm seeing in SCOTUS's decision on affirmative action. Now, as I said, I'm kind of enthused by the fact that the decision was made because it brings back to the table the discussion about K through 12 education. I mentioned earlier that this was that we took a formulaic approach to deal with past wrongs. And in doing so, we created a monster just like we did with busing. There is nothing wrong with community-based education. I think that's how you get the greatest participation of parents in the education process, particularly those who can't travel across the city to be involved. And being involved means being able to go to plays that their children are in during work hours. It means being able to attend sporting events that their children are participating in without having to threaten their jobs so that they can continue to provide for them. Community-based schools makes that a lot easier. It also creates an atmosphere where the parent and the teachers can actually become partners a lot easier. It makes it a lot easier to look up a teacher or give them an apple pie for something special that they might have done. And we become a community again. So I'm all for that. But let's not ignore the fact that redlining creates communities where some parents are at a disadvantage. Redlining creates an economic disparity where many parents can't help their children who might end up going to college. And when they get to college, they can't help them while they're in college because they've never been there. That's just one aspect. But to ignore the fact that for almost a century, many colleges would not accept certain demographics. And so there's a generation of college students who are first-timers who have no resource to depend on. These are the issues that are not addressed by the formulas that we were using in diversity to simply create a diverse environment. We became focused on one method rather than focused on the spirit of democracy, the spirit of education, the spirit of the village.
So, but with redlining, which is a political move, it's also a discriminatory move. So your community schools, correct me if I'm wrong, because of redlining, could also be lack integration.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah,
that's
no,
exactly what I'm saying.
I'm repeating it for me so I understand it.
Yes.
And it exacerbates the challenges that we have of trying to integrate and become one community.
So I grew up in a community-based school.
Yes, we talked about that.
It also happened to be a segregated system.
Yep.
And so the solution was busing.
Yep.
I hated busing. By the time we did it, I had a car. I didn't understand why I couldn't access the same resources in the high school in my community. Once again, it's ignoring reality. Our solutions ignored reality.
Well, none of these solutions look at the unintended consequences. You know, they are looked at, but the long-term consequence, even going back to original regulatory laws, nobody knows what the consequences will be long-term. We anticipate.
So, as I think about this, I realize, look, there's nothing wrong with a community school that happens to be all white or all Black. I went to an HBCU. I got a great education at an HBCU. I also had a half scholarship to Harvard. I probably would have gotten a great education there. And by all reports, it should have been better because of the resources that were there, et cetera. But I was protected at my HBCU. I was able to focus on my education at an HBCU that happened to be in my community. And my economic standard was not an issue as it might have been when I went to Harvard. It did not negatively impact my journey through education. What we were asking for was the right to choose. Now, the strategy behind busing was, you see, everything's politics, and I'm sure at some point we'll talk about even the political nature of SCOTUS. And we have been living under a false dream that the Supreme Court is not political. I would submit when the Supreme Court protected segregation until the 1950s, that's all you need to know about the politicalization of the Supreme Court. It has always been political. Our aspiration is that it should be the least politically influenced institution in our government. But we blew that when we can't even agree to allow candidates for the positions on the Supreme Court to express their opinion when they're being approved by the Senate. Now we ignore their writings. They will not refer to their opinions. And it's gotten to the point where I get the sense that during the early parts of their career, of a lawyer's or a judge's career, they write their opinions to try to influence legal law. And then when people begin to hold them serious and they realize that they might be potential candidates for SCOTUS, suddenly they stop writing. And suddenly they don't have opinions anymore. And they're coached not to answer theoretical questions.
Like they're running for office.
Like they're running for office. Exactly. And it's because we, as a society, have become redliners, if you will. If you're against Roe v. Wade, then you wouldn't get put on the court. If you're for Roe v. Wade, you'll be on the court. It just depends on the attitude at the time that you come up. Well, that's actually how we create balance on the court.
So I have an interesting question. The Supreme Court. The Supreme Court was established in the Constitution in the late 1700s. And at that point in time, the seats were defined for life, essentially, no term. The life expectancy back then was probably 40 years. Now, with the life expectancy being over 80, we have Supreme Court justices that serve over 40 years. What are your thoughts on term limits and or length of specific terms from a Supreme Court standpoint so that there is more frequent turnover? Could that make it worse? Could that make it better? Do you think it would have an impact?
So I believe that the lifelong appointment was designed to reduce the political influence as much as possible. That's the reason for it.
Okay.
We have undermined that purpose through our appointment system, our appointment process. And once again, we're looking for a simple solution to a complicated issue. See, this is exactly what I'm talking about. Why would I be messing with the term of Supreme Court judges when the problem is how they're appointed and approved?
Or maybe we need to do both.
Maybe. Maybe, but that's my point. Why don't we look at a more holistic view? There's also the argument that maybe 9 judges is not enough.
We could take a look at the entire Constitution for a lot of different things that were written back 230 years ago and just start to look at things a little bit differently as well.
Yes. And all of our listeners just stood up and said, oh my God, they're talking heresy. Because how many times do you open up the Practice Act?
Well, you're always a little scared to do so because you don't know what the unintended consequences would be when you do so.
I don't think that's it. I think you're scared to do so because you don't trust the intent of others.
Well, that's true. Those who, when you open up the Practice Act, can sneak in.
See, well, what do you think is going to happen with the Constitution? All of a sudden, I could become 3/5 of a person again.
Well, you're 3/5 and my 2/5. We have 1 vote.
I'm afraid your math is wrong. Your vote is 1 plus 2/5.
So I want to digress from the political implications for just a minute. And I want to get your thoughts on the academic implications, because that's where it started from. And that's where I suggest there may be a greater impact going forward. And you've been involved with academics for a long time. I know from my role within Western University that there are a lot of potential implications of affirmative action. Do you have any thoughts on how the ruling will impact the admissions process primarily at the universities around the country?
So I am not going to passively follow your lead here, because I don't think that we can have this discussion without thinking about the politics, without incorporating. I think we've made that mistake. I think we need to recognize that those insular discussions are a mistake. At some point, you do have to have them in order to come up with targeted policies. But those policies should include a prediction of impact and whether or not we can live with it or not. I'm sure you and I will have a discussion about the potential impact at Western and Western's vet school admissions. By the end of the day, Wednesday, I came to the conclusion that it doesn't have to change our approach very, very much. But again, I want to wait until I've had a chance to read the decision, because the practices at Western were not targeted for any group.
Like the reversal of Roe v. Wade, where states have essentially made independent decisions as to how they want to deal with that. Is there anything, and you, again, you haven't read the decision, but from what you understand is, and you may not be able to answer this, but is there anything that would preclude a university from not utilizing whatever policies they want to go forward?
Yes. So I think we're going to be in a world of hurt when it comes to lawsuits in the next decade.
So let's make more lawyers, right?
Well, you're going to need them for both sides. And unlike you, I think that's a worthy profession. You just muted yourself.
Some of them are worthy. Some of them should be muted.
Just like some veterinarians are worthy.
Absolutely.
And some should be, probably you and I should be muted. I think that this decision, this spate of decisions, this spate of conservatism that is coming out in the decisions, I honestly believe that a lot of these decisions are poorly crafted. But again, I haven't read them yet, right? But just from what I've heard, just from the pundits' analysis that I've listened to, there are a lot of things that are going to be challenged here. What has happened with the decision on affirmative action is that every university, in particularly public universities, will recognize a relief of pressure to achieve parity. And every university will be challenged to establish their values on their own. What I am fearful of is the recent tendency for governmental overreach in areas that they have no expertise in. What I am fearful of is the activism that may result in getting off the roundabout at an exit that leads to the past. That is the current danger. And that is why this isn't settled.
Well, this has been a very uplifting conversation.
Thank you, it has. But the one thing that we haven't really emphasized here is that, the reason we're focusing here is that the one piece of data that nobody refutes is that college graduates make more money in a lifetime than high school graduates. The other piece of data that nobody refutes is that the middle class has suffered over the last 50 years. And it has shrunk. The reason the middle class has shrunk is because we created a false economy. I shouldn't say false. We created an economy that rewarded college graduates rather than high school diplomas. The middle class in its heyday was primarily made up of high school graduates, and college graduates tended to fuel future change. And somehow we can't hire an administrative assistant unless they're a college graduate. And so that is nothing but a symptom to me of us focusing on the wrong aspect of education. We are members of a medical profession that requires even further training than a college graduate. As someone who's been interested in diversity, I have been frustrated for 40 years at the formulas that people look at. I have students right now who are disappointed in me because I don't have more African-American students in our population. And they don't see what it takes to make an applicant. And they don't understand the ramifications of restricted access to quality education from K through 12. And it all boils down to equity of access to resources in every community. So as much as I understand the social benefits of community education, of community-based schooling, I also understand the deviousness of our governmental influences in distributing those resources. And so I decided by Wednesday night, I had wasted my entire day focusing on higher education and the impact of this decision on higher education when I know I've lost thousands of potential applicants in the 8th grade. You know, I go fishing every summer with some of my best friends. We go to Alaska and we fish for salmon and halibut. And it's a good respite for me. You know, when we go out, I learned a lot about mariners, and I learned a lot about the jobs in the maritime industry, and the fact that, you know, I was sitting there thinking, I wish I could be a captain of a ship, you know, of a boat, you know, and just go out every day and watch people fish and help them fish and not have the worries of administration. But you go out and when you catch your quota of fish, you know, and you don't want to get arrested, you come back in. If you catch that quota, but you know, by 10 o'clock in the morning, then you got the rest of the day off. If you don't catch it till 5 o'clock, then the captain's going to take you in anyway because he wants the rest of the day off. You know, well, one day we were struggling. We weren't catching fish as fast as we normally did, and didn't understand why. And about 3 or 4 in the afternoon, we were about to go in. We passed this Russian trawler, and it's pulling in its net, and it's about to capsize. It has so many salmon in the net. And I suddenly realized why I wasn't catching any salmon, because there was a trawler in the area, and it was grabbing up it was grabbing up most of the salmon, and we were catching scrap. At some point, I realized that is a euphemistic analogy about our society. If you think of our children in restricted oceans of education, and you put trawlers in those communities, i.e., the police force, by the time the ones that don't get caught up in the legal net that we've created, I'm recruiting among the stragglers.
Maybe the stragglers are the smart ones because they avoided the net.
Okay, here's the problem. You infer that the ones in the net were the dumb ones.
Okay, I did infer that, but
they aren't. They're the unlucky ones.
Oh, maybe they were the followers and the ones who were the stragglers or the leaders.
Don't take this analogy too far.
Okay, I won't. No, I get it. I get it. I get it. No, I mean it makes complete sense. I mean, if the net is capturing the best of the best, you will accommodate with what is left.
Yes. I guess what I'm saying is, we've had discussions about your interactions with the police and my interactions with the police. There is a reason why I have a more intimate relationship with the police than you. And it's because our policing structure is designed to raise an alarm if I or someone like me suddenly pops up on their radar. And so those increased chances results in increased proclivities to have a legal record. And those increased chances, which results in increased chances for a record, results in increased incarceration for certain demographics. So when more of our people end up in prison than in college, it is not necessarily because they're bad people. And it is and part of that disparity in chance is centered in the quality of the schools that you're trying to keep them in.
We've kind of come full circle using the roundabout, and it still kind of goes back to the inequalities that we deal with and the failures that we have in many of the systems that we have. And I'm not suggesting that there's a way that rules and regulations are the answer. I'm just hoping that we can find an answer.
Yes,
a better answer.
And I'm not saying that it's a waste of time to even come up with rules and regulations. I'm not saying that either. I'm just saying that we have to have a broader sense of the picture than the myopic approaches we've been taking in the past.
Well, I'm just trying to figure out whether there's an end to this conversation, and there really isn't, because this conversation needs to continue, but it needs to continue at a more global level. And I think if we really want to have courageous conversations, the courageous conversations need to be in the influencers at the political level, at the judicial level, at the legislative level, because we're not having conversations. We're having unilateral conversations, but we're not having multi-party conversations. We're not sitting there looking to find solutions with multiple opinions. We have opinions that are divergent, and this goes back to conversations we've had multiple times about this chasm that exists, and we haven't been able to shrink the conversation to have both parties sharing their thoughts, sharing their ideas, and looking for solutions, global solutions, and not just unilateral solutions.
I would urge our listeners to read the SCOTUS decisions for themselves. One of my recent pet peeves has become that in order for us to have these conversations, we must be informed. And we have been hoodwinked if we think being informed means listening to Fox or MSNBC. I don't care what you think about any of the justices on the Supreme Court, and we all have reason to be disappointed in the behaviors of at least 3 of them recently. But if we believe in our system, then be that as it may, they are there, and they are there for life. Let me be clear. I disagree with the overturn of Roe v. Wade. I disagree with the decision on affirmative action. I support the decision on freedom of choice and freedom of speech in the LGBTQ case. This does not change my support of gender identification. I believe in this particular case, an individual expressed a position that she would not provide services for a religious reason. And until I read the decisions, I am inclined to support that. However, I do not believe that the court should have even adjudicated the case. First of all, because Colorado never asked her to do what she was afraid was going to occur. The court has thrown out cases because of lack of standing all the time. I don't understand how. Now, they do get into theoretical positions in their discussions. They did so in the affirmative action case. But I stand with Colorado in the fact that Colorado, as an institution, does not get to make that decision. And they must provide the same services. Whether that particular vendor wants to provide that service is up to that particular vendor. I have to read the Mississippi decision. I'm not surprised. But the point I'm trying to make is that all of these decisions took a year to come to.
Or more.
Or more. The written explanation of these decisions are important. And we haven't had time to digest them. And so we will address them again after we have become informed of the details of these decisions.
Well, right now we've been influenced by, as you know, to the news media.
Yes. Well, of course, because we have instantaneous 24-hour news, and we have people we trust. But we shouldn't trust anybody any more than we trust ourselves.
Well, and it's easier, Phil, to not do it ourselves, but to listen to somebody else tell us what to do.
No. Look, I learned this lesson during the debate on Obamacare. It began when one of our conservative representatives said that he hated Obamacare, but he supported, what was the other term for Obama, the name of the bill?
The Affordable Care Act?
Yes, he hated Obamacare, but he supported the Affordable Care Act.
Yeah. What does that tell you?
Yes. And that because of the Affordable Care Act, he was able to take care of his wife who had cancer.
Yeah, Obamacare would never have done that for him.
Obamacare was just pure welfare.
Yeah.
But I was having a discussion with a group of associates and with a group of friends during that time, and their biggest gripe about the passage of the Affordable Care Act was it was voted on by people who hadn't read the bill. You remember that was one of the arguments, that they changed the bill there were changes put in the bill 2 days before the vote, and nobody had time to read a 1,300 page bill in 2 days. Now, you and I both know, first of all, that this bill was put together over a year, and the changes that they were talking about affected 50 pages of the 1,300 pages of the bill. So nobody had to read all 1,300. Secondly, the representatives have staff.
Representatives don't read anything.
I wouldn't say that, but they know what's in the bill because their staff are charged with reading what's in the bill.
They get an overview. They get the crib notes.
Right. And when there are changes to the 50 pages, which are usually one line per page, then they inform their legislator what those changes mean, so that the legislator can make that decision. But the general argument was nobody's read this bill, so how can they pass it? Now, in response to that, and I kept hearing this, I finally just told myself, I need to read the bill. I need to know what's in it, because every time I got into an argument about healthcare, this inane argument that they didn't read the bill would come up. And the only way I could stop it was by to say, well, have you read it? Do you know what's in it? We are so dependent on our representatives that we go to pep rallies to determine which candidate we should vote for.
So, Phil, what was in the bill?
It's 1,300 pages. I'll be happy to show you my iPad where I've highlighted the things I liked. But nowhere in the bill was there any mention of death squads or anything else that was created.
Yeah, well.
And frankly, I don't have to tell you what was in the bill when every plan to repeal it has failed. And it is one of the most popular programs that we've had in healthcare because people who didn't even know they weren't covered.
What you're saying is, again, there are political decisions that aren't being made in the best interest of constituents, but there are political decisions that are being best made in the interest of political parties.
I'm not so sure that's what I was saying. That is an outcome.
Right.
What I am saying is that that a democracy fails when its citizenry are ill-informed.
And over the last 50 years or more, the volume of information that has spewed out has buried us to the detriment of knowledge.
Well, I'm not sure that the volume of information is the problem. I think the variety of that information is the problem, which adds to the volume.
Right.
But the volume, but the amount of information that matters is the information that goes into law. And in these days of instantaneous dissemination of information, we shouldn't have to worry about bots, foreign influence, or anything else when we can get the bill and read it for ourselves, when we can get the decisions and read them for ourselves. It doesn't matter where you get your news from if you understand what the news is about.
So what happens is you get something that looks this thick and you read the first page and the last page, and you hope that everything in between is congruous with the first page and the last page.
I'm not even sure we get the book.
So
we get somebody who bought the book. We listen to people who buy the book or downloads the book.
Right. We're looking for a 30-second summary of 1,100 pages or 1,300 pages.
Yeah. And we act like it matters to us. It matters so much to us that we're willing to denigrate people for having a different opinion that we were taught, not that we formed based on facts.
You know, you use the word taught, and I would question whether it's taught or we were told.
Okay. I accept that. I don't care how you adopted the position.
Right.
Right. I consider it, but see, I consider it a form of teaching when people start spewing facts or alternative facts.
Fake news.
You know, that's their form of teaching. You know, I will never forget when former President Trump would say, well, you know, white folk get killed by police too. The statistic about blacks being overrepresented in police violence is false. I mean, that's all he said. But he was teaching me something.
True. What was your take-home message, Dr. Nelson?
I have none.
Yeah.
We've been all in a roundabout. There's no take-home.
Right. Well, the cure for COVID was hydroxychloroquine as well.
Yes.
And bleach, IV.
I understand.
That's being told.
Like I said, my take-home message is if we truly want to participate in a viable democracy, it is dependent on us to be informed citizens. And informed isn't based on the channel that you watch.
It's in the complexity there is no way the founding fathers, of course, we call them founding fathers because if you want to talk about segregation back then, there were no founding mothers and there are no founding people of color, but that's okay. The founding fathers could not in any way, shape, or form envisioned the complexity of the world 230 years later. They were living in very simple times where the only way information was carried, or knowledge was carried, was by a horse. And so change was much slower. Information sharing was much slower. And there's no way they could have envisioned. So how do we have a conversation in 2023 and get appropriate information and knowledge in a slower fashion? Because the minute you got done reading the 1,300 pages of the Affordable Care Act, there was another 1,300 pages that needed to be read. And it's really important for us to try to figure out how to get this knowledge in ourselves faster, more appropriately, because our political system originally was not built for the way it is right now.
I disagree.
Okay.
Which shouldn't be a surprise.
I set you up for that.
Yes, you did. I mean, come on. During colonial times, when we were in an agrarian society, we didn't have television. We had plenty of time to read, if we could read. A smaller proportion of the population actually read at that time. And yet we developed this governmental structure that everybody marvels at, because our leaders at the time spent their nights reading. Now, the books that they read were books that had been written in medieval times almost, including the Bible, and their values stem from that. If we recognize that, we have a greater capacity. Yes, there's a lot more information. I get that. But we don't have to be all things to all people. We don't have to be an expert in everything. We should focus on our values and our interests. And just because another 1,300 pages about something else comes up doesn't mean I have to go get it. What I should be focusing on are those things that affects me primarily, and those things that I value that might affect my children.
But those 1,300 pages of information, somebody's got to read them.
And I'm saying that in a democracy, if everybody focus, first of all, those 1,300 pages were important to somebody. That's why they were created.
True.
So there's going to be a segment of society that's going to read every aspect. There's going to be a segment of society. There's going to be some documents that's going to attract everybody,
yes,
like the Affordable Care Act.
Yes.
Trade with China is not going to attract everybody until it affects everybody. The only point I'm trying to make is those that it affects needs to get their information. We have a greater capacity to get original information directly to the consumer, directly to the voter, directly to the citizen. We don't have to wait a year for the book to be published and another year to publish enough books that we can get it.
Correct. We can get it to them, but do they want to read it? Are they willing to read it?
Yes.
Is the number of distractions that has been created diluted and diluted out our willingness to learn?
That's the responsibility of the citizen.
Well, there are citizens that participate and there are citizens that skate, and the numbers that skate are much greater.
I understand that. And I am urging a particular behavior.
We hope that the listeners that we have are part of a society that is participatory in nature and is a victor, not a victim.
Well, I can't believe that anybody who would take the time to listen to us isn't already engaged.
Yes, I give credit to Nicole, who listens to everything we have to say. No, I agree. I mean, if you're willing to listen to our diatribes, you have an interest in the world, and you have an interest in making the world a better place. And we thank you for that.
And I'm just suggesting that our involvement, the quality of our involvement, the potential outcomes of our involvement are based on the information that we receive.
Hey, good to see you. To our listeners, thank you very much. And to Nationwide, we appreciate it and your support.
Hear, hear.
Thank you for joining us for another courageous conversation. Be sure to follow us and check back next week for more.